June 1944. The Philippine Sea. The tropical sun burned down on the flight deck of the Taihō, the newest armored pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of fuel oil and salt spray. For the pilots and sailors, this was the moment they had waited 2 years for. They called it Kantai Kessen, the Decisive Battle. In the minds of these men, the United States was weakening. They believed the reports from Tokyo. They believed that after the brutal battles of the Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, the American Navy had been left in tatters. They believed that American carriers, the Hornet, the Wasp, the Lexington, were rusting at the bottom of the ocean, and that the enemy simply could not recover in time. Lieutenant Commander Akira stood on the bridge, his hands gripping his binoculars. He belonged to the old generation of officers, men who believed a warship was a work of art, forged by hand over years of labor. In his mind, and in the mind of the Empire, building an aircraft carrier was a supreme national effort, consuming vast resources and time. To lose a ship was to lose a limb that could never grow back. He recalled the proud announcements on the radio. The American fleet has been paralyzed. We have broken their spine. The young soldiers around him were tying hachimaki headbands, their eyes burning with determination. They believed that with the Yamato spirit alone, they would sweep away the last remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They thought they were hunting a wounded animal. The sea was calm, too calm. But then, from the east, a black dot appeared on the horizon. Then 2, then 10, then a wall of steel. Akira squinted, trying to focus his lenses. He expected to see a few lonely cruisers, perhaps an old carrier hastily patched together. But what hit his eyes was not a ragged fleet. It was a floating city. His heart skipped a beat. He saw Essex-class carriers. Not one, but a multitude. They were brand new. Their paint gleamed under the sun, showing no scars of battle. And surrounding them were cruisers and destroyers, thick as a school of sharks protecting their kings. "Impossible," an aide whispered beside him, his voice trembling, breaking the code of stoicism. "We sank the Yorktown. We saw the Enterprise burn. Why are they there?" But the most terrifying thing was not the new ships. It was the old names. Akira saw the number painted on the island of the lead carrier. Number 10. USS Yorktown. It sank. His mind screamed. He didn't know that Americans didn't just salvage old ships. They simply built new ones, bigger, stronger, and gave them the old names as an arrogant challenge. And there, the Enterprise, the Grey Ghost. It should have been in dry dock at Pearl Harbor, with fatal wounds. Instead, it was here, cutting through the waves at full speed, launching hundreds of brand new Hellcats into the sky. In that moment, on the bridge of the Taihō, a cold truth began to creep into the minds of Akira and his men. They realized they were not fighting an army. They were fighting a production line. They had calculated war using courage and tactics, but their enemy calculated war using steel tonnage and man-hours. What took Japan 3 years to build, the Americans seemed to create in mere weeks. The wall of steel on the horizon stretched forever, blotting out the sun. And for the first time, the fear did not come from death, but from hopelessness. How can you kill an enemy when, for every head you cut off, 3 more grow back, shinier and deadlier than before? The alarm sirens screamed, tearing through the air. But to Akira, it didn't sound like a call to battle. It sounded like a death knell for an illusion. The sky above the Philippine Sea did not just darken with clouds, it darkened with aluminum. From the flight decks of those American carriers, the ones that were supposed to be dead, swarm after swarm of F-6F Hellcats roared into the air. To the Japanese pilots sitting in their cockpits, it must have looked like a plague of locusts. These men were the remnants of the elite, the spiritual heirs of the samurai. They gripped their controls, reciting prayers, trusting in the agility of their legendary Zeros. They believed that skill and spirit could overcome numbers. But the Americans had changed the equation. They weren't just sending planes, they were sending flying tanks. The Hellcat wasn't elegant. It didn't dance in the air like a Zero. It was a brick with wings, a rugged, heavy beast built for one purpose, to take a beating and keep killing. As the two forces collided, the tragedy of the Japanese strategy was laid bare in seconds. A Zero pilot would execute a perfect maneuver, twisting behind a Hellcat, pouring 20mm cannon fire into its fuselage. In the old days, against a Wildcat, that would have been a kill. But the Hellcat just shuddered, absorbed the blow, and kept flying. Then, the American pilot would simply turn, unleash a burst from his 6 50 caliber machine guns, and the Zero, unarmored, fragile, filled with volatile fuel, would explode into a ball of fire. It wasn't a duel. It was an execution. On the bridge of the Taihō, the reports coming in over the radio were a chaotic litany of screams. "I'm hit. I'm going down. They are everywhere. My bullets bounce off them." The officers listened in stunned silence. They were witnessing the destruction of their naval aviation, not over days or weeks, but in hours. The Americans later called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. To them, it was a sport. To the Japanese, it was the systematic erasure of a generation. But the true horror wasn't just the technology. It was the men inside the machines. The Japanese pilots fighting that day were brave, but many were barely out of flight school. Their veterans had died in the Solomons, and the Empire's training system, rigid, slow, elitist, could not replace them fast enough. Across the ocean, the American system was different. It was a factory of killers. The United States didn't treat pilots like rare artisans. They treated them like standardized components. They took farm boys and factory workers, put them through a rigorous, scientifically designed training program, and churned out thousands of competent aviators every month. They rotated their veterans back home to teach the rookies, ensuring that every new wave was smarter than the last. The Japanese kept their aces at the front until they died. The knowledge died with them. So when those young Japanese pilots looked out of their canopies, they didn't just see more planes. They saw a system that learned faster than they did. They saw an enemy that didn't rely on the brilliance of a few, but on the competence of the many. By late afternoon, the sky was clear of Japanese planes. The decisive battle was over before the surface ships even fired a shot. The carrier Taihō, the armored giant, was sinking not from an overwhelming bombardment, but from a single torpedo hit that was mishandled by an inexperienced crew. As the sun set over the smoking ruin of the Imperial fleet, a terrifying realization settled in. The Americans hadn't just won a battle, they had demonstrated that they could absorb the worst the Empire could throw at them, rebuild it twice as strong, and return to the fight without missing a beat. And the worst part? The American fleet on the horizon was already turning its attention to the next target. They weren't stopping to celebrate. They were just moving to the next item on a checklist. The machine did not pause for glory. It only moved forward, while the battered remains of the Japanese fleet limped back to Singapore to hoard what little fuel they had left. The American fleet did something that defied the laws of naval warfare. They didn't go back to Pearl Harbor. They didn't return to California for repairs. They simply moved the harbor to the battlefield. Deep in the Pacific, inside the vast lagoon of Ulithi Atoll, the United States Navy pulled off a magic trick greater than any radar or proximity fuse. Overnight, a quiet ring of coral islands became the third largest naval port in the world. To a Japanese observer, this sight would have been more demoralizing than a bombing raid. Hundreds of ships filled the lagoon, but they weren't destroyers or battleships. They were floating factories. There were dry docks towed all the way from America, capable of lifting a 40,000-ton ship out of the water to repair hull damage right there in the middle of the ocean. There were tankers, ammo ships, hospital ships, and tenders. The Japanese Navy operated on a tether. They had to return to base to rearm, to refuel, to rest. Every mile traveled was a calculation of scarce resources. But the Americans had cut the tether. They created the fleet train, a logistical conveyor belt that stretched 6,000 miles back to San Francisco. They could fight forever because they brought their home with them. And then there was the ultimate insult. The most devastating weapon in the American arsenal wasn't a bomb. It was a barge, a concrete barge, ugly and slow, designated as a BRL. Its sole purpose? To manufacture ice cream. Imagine the mindset of a Japanese soldier on a bypassed island nearby. He is eating roots and lizards. He has been told that his sacrifice is necessary to save the emperor, that the enemy is a ruthless monster. He is starving, his uniform is rotting off his body, and he is counting his last rounds of ammunition. And then he learns that just a few miles away, the enemy is producing 500 gallons of ice cream every single shift, vanilla and chocolate. It wasn't just food, it was a statement of infinite excess. While Japan stripped its civilians of metal pots and pans to build aircraft parts, the United States had enough industrial capacity to dedicate entire ships to frozen desserts. To the starving Japanese soldier, this was a psychological sledgehammer. It told him that the enemy wasn't just winning, The enemy wasn't even straining. The Americans didn't just bring weapons to the war. They brought their standard of living. They brought movies, cold beer, fresh steak, and mail from home that arrived in days, not months. This luxury was a strategic weapon. It kept American morale high, while the Japanese spirit was ground down by austerity. The Japanese fought with the desperation of men with nothing left to lose. The Americans fought with the confidence of men who had everything they needed, and more. The war had become a collision between a culture of sacrifice and a culture of abundance. And abundance was winning. The Japanese general staff could model troop movements and ship tonnage, but they couldn't model a supply chain that treated ice cream as an essential military supply. It was an absurdity that signaled the end of the empire just as surely as the mushroom clouds that would come later. The message was clear. We have so much, we can waste it, and you have nothing. By late 1944, the Japanese High Command had accepted a grim truth. They could no longer match the Americans in steel, fuel, or skill. The disparity was too great. So, they turned to the only resource they had left in abundance: human life. They unveiled the kamikaze, the divine wind. It was a strategy born of pure desperation, but it possessed a terrifying logic. A novice pilot couldn't shoot down a Hellcat, but he could crash a plane into a ship. They didn't need to return. They didn't need to be aces. They just needed to be guided missiles with a heartbeat. For a brief moment, the Americans were shaken. How do you stop an enemy who wants to die? The psychological impact of seeing a Zero screaming down from the clouds, its pilot tied in with a ceremonial scarf, intent on oblivion, was profound. It defied the Western instinct for survival. But the United States Navy didn't respond with fear. It responded with physics. While Japan was asking its sons to die for the emperor, American laboratories were perfecting a secret weapon that would make that sacrifice meaningless. It was called the VT fuse, or the proximity fuse. Before this, anti-aircraft shells were crude. They had to hit the plane directly, or be set with a timer to explode at a specific altitude. It was a guessing game. A Japanese pilot could weave through the flak, trusting that the odds were in his favor. The VT fuse changed the laws of the game. Inside the nose of every American 5-inch shell was a tiny, miraculous radio transmitter, a miniaturized radar set the size of a milk bottle. It sent out a signal. When that signal bounced off a plane and returned, the shell knew it was close enough. It didn't need to hit the target. It just needed to get near it. Imagine the horror of a kamikaze pilot in those final months. He dives toward an American battleship. He sees the muzzle flashes. He begins his evasive maneuvers, banking left, banking right, dancing through the sky as he has been trained. He thinks he is safe because the shells are missing him by 50 feet. Then, suddenly, the air around him turns into a blender. The shells explode not on impact, but in proximity. A wall of shrapnel shreds his wings, his engine, and his cockpit. He is dead before he even understands why. He wasn't outflown. He wasn't outgunned. He was outcomputed. Coupled with this was the CIC, the Combat Information Center. American ships were no longer fought from the bridge by a captain looking through binoculars. They were fought from a dark, air-conditioned room deep inside the hull, glowing with green radar screens. There, young officers tracked incoming raids from 100 miles away. They directed fighter patrols and aimed guns with mathematical precision. The Japanese pilot, flying alone in his noisy cockpit, squinting into the sun, thought he was a samurai engaging in a duel. In reality, he was just a blip on a screen, a variable in a firing solution that had been solved minutes ago. The contrast was absolute. Japan was fighting a war of spiritual purity, throwing flesh and blood against the iron. America was fighting a war of electronic efficiency, turning slaughter into a science. The divine wind failed because it ran into an invisible wall of technology. Courage, no matter how fanatical, cannot fight mathematics. The Japanese soldiers realized with sinking hearts that their willingness to die was no longer a weapon. It was just a waste. The American machine didn't care about their spirit. It just processed them, erased them, and scanned the horizon for the next target. By the time the American war machine reached the sacred soil of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the nature of the conflict had shifted again. It was no longer a war of movement. It had become a war of erasure. The Japanese defenders, dug deep into volcanic caves and coral ridges, called it Tetsu no Aim, the typhoon of steel. In the Japanese army, an artillery shell was a precious object. It was hoarded. A gun crew might wait days for a clear target before firing, terrified of wasting the emperor's metal. Logistics were a nightmare. Every bullet that reached the front line had been carried by sweating laborers or smuggled on small boats under the cover of darkness. Scarcity defined their existence. But looking out from their bunkers, what they saw offshore defied comprehension. The American invasion fleet didn't just arrive. It parked, and then it opened fire. For days, sometimes weeks before a single Marine boot touched the sand, the Navy unleashed a bombardment of biblical proportions. Battleships like the USS New Jersey and USS Missouri turned their massive 16-inch guns toward the islands. These were weapons designed to sink other battleships in the open ocean. Instead, the Americans were using them to chop down trees, pulverize rocks, and collapse tunnels. It was an industrial demolition project. The sound was a continuous, rolling thunder that shook the teeth of men hiding 50 feet underground. To the Japanese commander, this was madness. The cost of the ammunition alone was staggering. Millions of dollars turned into smoke and noise every hour. In the logic of the empire, this was wasteful. Why burn a forest just to kill a sniper? But the Americans had a different logic. Metal is cheap. Life is expensive. If spending 10,000 shells saved the life of one Marine, the United States would spend 20,000. They didn't care about the budget. They cared about the result. And the bombardment never stopped. This was the true miracle that stunned the Japanese observers. A battleship can only carry so much ammunition. Eventually, it must run dry. It must return to base. But the American ships didn't leave. Instead, right there in the combat zone, fat, slow ammunition ships pulled alongside the battleships. In the middle of the ocean, under the cover of smoke screens, cranes swung massive pallets of shells from one deck to another. They reloaded the guns while they were still hot. The supply chain was a living, breathing artery that connected the factories of Pittsburgh directly to the beaches of the Pacific. The Japanese soldier, starving and counting his last clip of rifle ammo, watched as the enemy threw steel at him as if it were dirt. He realized then that he wasn't fighting soldiers, he was fighting a landslide. When the landing craft finally came, they didn't come in waves. They came in a solid wall. Hundreds of Amtrak's amphibious tractors clawed over the reefs, unstopped by the terrain. Behind them were tank landing ships, disgorging Shermans, bulldozers, and flamethrowers. The Japanese had prepared to fight men. They had trained in bayonet drills and hand-to-hand combat, believing their spirit would overcome the enemy's softness. But the Americans refused to play that game. They didn't send men into the caves with knives. They sent bulldozers to seal the entrances. They sent tanks to pour liquid fire into the vents. It was a systematic, impersonal destruction of the landscape itself. The Japanese soldier realized with horror that his bravery was irrelevant. You cannot intimidate an artillery shell. You cannot banish a bulldozer with a battle cry. The enemy had turned war into an engineering problem, and they were solving it with crushing, mechanical weight. By the spring of 1945, the war had crossed the ocean and arrived at the doorstep of every Japanese citizen. It came in the form of a silver glint in the sky, so high up that it looked like a harmless toy. This was the B-29 superfortress. To the Japanese engineers watching from the ground, this machine was a technological nightmare. It was twice the size of anything they could build. It flew at 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese fighters could climb, and faster than they could intercept. It had pressurized cabins, allowing the American crews to fly in shirt sleeves, while Japanese pilots froze in their open cockpits, gasping for oxygen. But the B-29 represented something more terrifying than just altitude. It represented the ultimate industrial disparity. Japan was a nation of wood and paper. Its cities were built from flammable materials, huddled together in tight districts. The Americans knew this, and they didn't just send bombs, they sent chemistry. General Curtis LeMay, a man who viewed war purely as an efficiency problem, made a cold calculation. He realized that high-altitude precision bombing wasn't working because of the jet stream winds, so he changed the tactic. He ordered the B-29 seconds to fly low, at night, and stripped of their defensive guns to carry more weight. And the weight they carried was the M69 incendiary. It was a cluster bomb, filled with a new, sticky substance called napalm. When it hit the ground, it didn't just explode, it splattered. It clung to walls, to roofs, to skin. It burned at temperatures that could melt glass. On the night of the 9th of March 1945, the citizens of Tokyo looked up and saw the sky turn red. It wasn't the sunrise. It was the night of the black snow. Over 300 B-29 seconds unloaded their cargo on the capital. In a matter of hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo simply ceased to exist. The firestorm was so intense that it sucked the oxygen out of the air, suffocating people who weren't even touched by the flames. Canals boiled, glass bottles melted into puddles. To the Japanese leadership, this was the moment the logic of the war collapsed entirely. They had told their people that the Americans were cowards, that they wouldn't have the stomach for a long fight. But here was an enemy that was systematically burning their civilization to the ground, city by city, night after night. And the most horrifying part for the survivors was the sound. The B-29 seconds didn't sound like normal planes. Their 4 massive engines created a deep, vibrating hum that could be felt in the bones. When hundreds of them flew together, it sounded like the earth itself was groaning. The next morning, looking at the charred wasteland that used to be a vibrant neighborhood, a Japanese factory worker realized the futility of his labor. Why build a zero part today if the factory will be burned tomorrow? Why save rations if the warehouse is gone? The Americans had brought the factory line to the sky. They were dismantling Japan not soldier by soldier, but block by block. The Japanese government had promised that the divine wind would save them. But looking at the ashes of Tokyo, the people realized that the only wind blowing was the firestorm created by American science. The separation between the front line and the home front had vanished. The war was no longer something happening over there. It was happening in their living rooms, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. While the skies over Japan turned red with fire, the oceans around it turned silent. The Americans were not just burning the house down, they were locking the doors and cutting off the water. This was the submarine war, the silent service. Japan is an island nation. It has no oil, no rubber, no aluminum. To survive, it must breathe through the sea. Its arteries were the merchant ships, the maras, that hauled resources from the conquered territories in the south back to the factories in the north. For the first years of the war, this system worked. But by 1945, the arteries had been severed. Captain Sato stood on the bridge of an oil tanker in the South China Sea. He was terrified, not of battleships, but of the nothingness. The American submarines had become ghosts. In the early days, they had to surface to attack, or fire faulty torpedoes that bounced off hulls. But the American machine had fixed its errors. Now, they stayed submerged, guided by radar and sonar that could see through the pitch-black night. Sato didn't know it, but his course, his speed, and his cargo were already known to the enemy before he even left port. The Americans had broken the naval codes. They weren't hunting, they were waiting. Suddenly, the ship ahead of him, a freighter carrying thousands of tons of rice, erupted. There was no wake of a torpedo, no periscope feather, just a sudden, violent column of water and steel. Before the sound of the explosion even faded, the ship astern was hit. It was a massacre. The Americans were sinking ships faster than Japan could name them. In Tokyo, the Ministry of Munitions stared at graphs that looked like a cliff edge. The red line represented imports. It had collapsed. The shipyards were screaming for steel, but the iron ore was at the bottom of the ocean. The airfields had planes, but the aviation fuel was burning in the Philippine Sea. The Japanese war machine was starving to death. The Americans had achieved something that no navy in history had ever done so completely: a total blockade. They had drawn a noose around the home islands and were tightening it every day. The psychological toll on the Japanese sailors was absolute. They called these convoy routes transport of death. To step onto a merchant ship was a suicide mission. There was no glory in it. You didn't die fighting. You died drowning in oil, attacked by an enemy you never saw, and the hunger began to spread to the civilians. The daily ration of rice dropped to a handful. People were mixing sawdust with flour. The government told them to endure, to forage for acorns, to show the Yamato spirit. But spirit cannot replace calories. The American submarines were ruthless efficiency experts. They targeted the tankers first. No oil meant the remaining battleships of the Imperial Navy were trapped in port, reduced to floating anti-aircraft batteries. No oil meant pilot training was cut to a few hours because they couldn't spare the gas for practice flights. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, for which Japan had gone to war, was still there on the map. It was full of riches, oil, rubber, food, but it might as well have been on the moon. The American wall of steel under the waves had made it unreachable. As Captain Sato's own ship took a torpedo amidships, plunging him into the dark water, he realized the ultimate failure of the empire. They had built a warrior navy to fight great battles, but they had forgotten to protect the simple, ugly cargo ships that kept the nation alive. The Americans hadn't just beaten their warriors, they had starved their children. The war was no longer a contest of arms, it was a siege, and the castle was empty. The fighting on the islands usually ended with a strange silence, but for the Japanese survivors hiding in the caves of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the silence didn't last long. It was replaced by a new sound, one that was perhaps even more demoralizing than the artillery. It was the sound of diesel engines, but these weren't tanks, they were bulldozers. This was the arrival of the Seabees, the United States Naval Construction Battalions. Their motto was, "Can do," but to the Japanese, watching from the hills, their work looked like industrial sorcery. In the Japanese military tradition, building an airfield was a monumental task. It required thousands of laborers, months of digging with picks and shovels, and the painstaking laying of crushed stone. It was backbreaking, slow work. But the Americans treated geography like a minor inconvenience. Lieutenant Yamashita, starving and wounded deep in the jungle of a captured island, watched through the leaves in disbelief. He saw a hill that had existed for 1,000 years. Then, he watched a swarm of yellow machines attack it. In the morning, the hill was there. By sunset, it was gone, flat, erased. The next day, strange machines laid down steel mats or poured quick-drying concrete. By the third day, a massive C-54 transport plane was landing on a runway that hadn't existed 72 hours earlier. "They are not just conquering the land," Yamashita whispered to his sergeant. "They are remodeling it." It was a terrifying realization. The Americans brought their civilization with them. They built roads, hospitals, power plants, and cinemas, while the smoke of battle was still clearing. They installed ice machines and hot showers on islands that had been uninhabited volcanic rocks a week before. This speed of construction meant that the Japanese strategy of defense in depth was useless. They had hoped to slow the Americans down, to make them bleed for every inch, to exhaust them. But how do you exhaust an enemy who can build a city faster than you can dig a foxhole? On the island of Tinian, the Seabees built the largest airport in the world at that time, Northfield. It had 4 massive runways, each 2 miles long. It was a sprawling complex of asphalt and coral that could launch hundreds of B-29 seconds simultaneously. From the perspective of a Japanese soldier, this was the ultimate display of dominance. It said, "We are not visitors, we are here to stay." The psychological impact was devastating. It stripped away the hope that the Americans would eventually tire and go home. You don't pour millions of tons of concrete if you plan to leave. You pour concrete when you own the future. Yamashita looked at his own shovel, a rusty tool he had used to dig a shallow grave for his comrades. Then he looked at the massive American cranes lifting steel beams in the distance. He realized then that the war wasn't just a clash of soldiers, it was a clash of eras. He was fighting in the feudal age with spirit and blood. The enemy was fighting in the industrial age with torque and horsepower, and the construction never stopped. Night and day, under the glare of floodlights that turned midnight into noon, the machines roared. They were paving the road to Tokyo, quite literally, one island at a time. The Japanese soldier realized he could kill 10 Americans, or 100. It wouldn't matter. The bulldozers would just bury them, pave over the spot, and keep moving forward. The concrete tsunami was unstoppable. By August 1945, the Japanese Empire was a corpse that refused to close its eyes. The cities were burned, the navy was sunk, and the people were starving. But the military hardliners still clung to one final hope, Ketsu-go Operation Decisive. They planned to mobilize 28 million civilians with bamboo spears to meet the American invasion on the beaches. They believed that if they could inflict enough casualties, the Americans would negotiate. They were betting on American fatigue. But the Americans were not tired. They were just finishing a science experiment. On the morning of August 6, Japanese radar operators detected a small blip, 3 B-29 seconds. In the past, they would have scrambled fighters. But now, fuel was so scarce that they didn't bother intercepting small groups. They thought it was a weather reconnaissance mission. At 8:15 a.m., over the city of Hiroshima, the concept of warfare changed forever. There was no sound of 1,000 engines. There was no hours-long bombardment. There was just a single parachute drifting down, followed by a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. In a microsecond, The temperature on the ground reached 4,000 degrees Celsius. Steel bridges liquefied, stone turned into gas. People simply vanished, leaving only their shadows burned onto the pavement. When the reports reached Tokyo, they were nonsensical. The city is gone, not damaged, gone. The military leaders couldn't comprehend it. A single plane? Impossible. It violated the laws of physics as they knew them. They sent Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist, to investigate. He flew over the ruins, looking down at the red, radioactive scar where a metropolis used to be. He didn't need instruments. He saw the pattern of destruction and realized the terrifying truth. "It is an atomic device," he whispered. The shock that rippled through the Japanese high command was not just about the death toll, it was about the industrial implication. Japan had its own nuclear program during the war. They knew the theory, but they had calculated that enriching enough uranium to build a bomb would require more electricity than the entire nation of Japan could produce, and would cost billions of dollars. They had concluded it was impossible for anyone to do it before the war ended. But the Americans had done it. While fighting a two-front war in Europe and the Pacific, while building thousands of ships and planes, the United States had secretly built an entirely new industry, the Manhattan Project, hidden in the deserts of New Mexico and the valleys of Tennessee. They had built factories the size of cities just to filter uranium isotopes. They had spent $2 billion, an astronomical sum, on a gamble. To the Japanese leadership, this was the ultimate checkmate. They weren't just outgunned, they were out-evolved. The enemy had unlocked the secrets of the stars and bottled them into a weapon. 3 days later, before Japan could even process the horror of Hiroshima, it happened again over Nagasaki. This was the final psychological blow. It implied that the Americans had an assembly line of these weapons. It implied that the reign of ruin would never stop until every Japanese person was erased from history. The emperor, hearing the reports of the new and most cruel bomb, finally understood that the spirit of Yamato was irrelevant. You cannot charge at a nuclear explosion with a bayonet. You cannot endure radiation with willpower. The war had moved beyond strategy, beyond courage, and beyond humanity. It had become a force of nature, controlled by American engineers. The sun had been stolen from the sky and dropped on their heads, and there was no defense against the sun. September Duwa, 1940 Ma, Tokyo Bay. The sky was grey, hanging low over the water, but the water itself was invisible. It was covered by steel. When the small boat carrying the Japanese surrender delegation approached the USS Missouri, the officials looked out the windows and saw something that stopped their breath. They saw the Third Fleet. It wasn't just a fleet. It was a floating continent. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers stretched as far as the eye could see. There were ships here that had been reported sunk 3 or 4 times by Japanese propaganda. Yet here they were, freshly painted, rust-free, their flags snapping in the wind. Mamoru Shigemitsu, the Japanese foreign minister, struggled up the gangway of the Missouri. He walked with a cane, his leg lost to a bomb years earlier. His physical frailty was a perfect metaphor for his nation. He was dressed in a formal top hat and tails, a relic of the 19th century. Waiting for him on the deck were the Americans. They wore simple khaki uniforms. They didn't look like samurais. They looked like mechanics, engineers, and factory foremen. They stood tall, well-fed, and healthy. As Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender, his hand shaking slightly, he wasn't just surrendering to an army. He was surrendering to the future. He realized that the Yamato spirit, the belief that willpower could bend reality, had been a lie. The reality was standing all around him. It was made of rivets, radar, and endless supply chains. And then, the final lesson was delivered. As the signatures were drying on the parchment, a low rumble began in the distance. It grew louder, shaking the deck of the massive battleship. The Japanese delegates looked up. From the south came the planes. First came 450 carrier fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs, flying in precise formation. These were the machines that had cleared the skies. Behind them came the heavy bombers, the B-29 seconds, not 10 of them, not 50, but hundreds. They filled the sky from horizon to horizon. The noise was deafening, a mechanical roar that drowned out the wind and the waves. It was the sound of total, undisputed dominance. Toshikazu Kase, a Japanese diplomat present on the deck, later wrote that he felt crushed by the sheer weight of the display. It wasn't a military parade, it was an industrial statement. It said, We built all of this while fighting Germany. We built all of this while feeding half the world. And if you hadn't surrendered, we would have built 10 times more. The war was over. The samurai had lost to the engineer. For the Japanese soldier returning home to a burned-out city, looking at the jeeps and bulldozers of the occupation forces clearing the rubble, the lesson was bitter but clear. Japan had fought with the soul of a warrior, but America had fought with the mind of a machine. And the terrifying, magnificent truth about the American machine was the one thing the Japanese had realized too late. From the first day at Guadalcanal to the last day in Tokyo Bay. It didn't hate, it didn't pause, it didn't tire, it just produced, and it never stopped.